We will start with a keynote presentation by Lutz Leistenring. He's the founder of Vice Lab, and he's also the president of the Berlin Club Commission. He'll talk mostly about the economic importance of nightlife. And after that, we'll turn into our first panel discussion. We'll have 5 over the course of the weekend. It's going to talk about the societal importance of nightlife. So I'll pass the word then to our moderator, Jean-Hugues Kaiboikou, who will be moderating the discussion. He's a self-taught web developer, critic, multi-instrumentalist, a DJ and a promoter, and he uses his knowledge of tech and his good pen to push for societal change. He writes mostly for Mixmag and Resident Advisor. I think that's it for me, so I'll be seeing more of you in the next 3 days. If you have questions in the meantime, make sure to just comment in the platform that we're using, and we'll make sure to follow up and try to listen to everybody. Thank you so much for your support and for being with us. I hope you have a good 3 days. Thank you.
So today we're gonna have a discussion on night culture and space influence, who are revolving around visitor, artist, employee, owner, and various other stakeholders. We'll start with a keynote by Lutz. I will try to not butcher your name, Leistenring. So let me know if you do a little okay, if it was fine. It was all right. Who is a co-founder of Vibe Lab and the Berlin Club Commission. And we will also have Jonas Rutgerts. Also, let me know if it was fine for the name, if I didn't butcher it too much. All right. Who's a researcher within the field of dance music and within the field of dance culture and nightlife. And we'll have Karin Abdullah, who is the head of Outer, the agency and management arm of Berlin Atonal. And we have also Liz Kingman, who's been working on the topic of dance and space of urgency, together with Bogomir Doringer. So yeah, you're cool. Should we start with the keynote of Lutz already?
Okay, I will. I will share my screen. Thanks for having me, and I keep it. I try to keep it at half an hour, but maybe you have to give me a sign at one point. Okay. So is everybody able to see the screen? Just need one.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So I was introduced already. I will do this also during the presentation. The reason why I'm engaged in this field is because when cities talk about to create a music scene or to create a vibrant nightlife, they usually show me these kind of pictures. This is the Mercedes Arena in Berlin, but you have also big, large arenas all over the world. It is for sure some energy happening there. But the question is, are you really like supporting grassroots movements? Are you supporting people on the ground that are developing their talent? Or are you just flying big stars into your city and create vibe there? And then the other question is, how do we want to identify with a city when they all look basically the same? These are just some pictures I took in Berlin around in the last couple of years. So facades are always the same. And also when it comes to how the inner cities look like, you see coffee chains all over the world, and believe me, the coffee tastes the same everywhere. In Berlin, we already started 1949 to create something that is very special. That actually was one of the big parts of succession of Berlin nightlife, and it happened 1949 after the Second World War, when the guy on the left, Heinz Sauermeier, he was the representative man for the hotels and bars and restaurants organization, met General Frank Hawley, who was the representative general from the US as part of the allies that are in West Berlin present. And he was having a big problem because there was a curfew at 9 p.m. and everybody had to basically leave bars and restaurants at 9. And this caused a lot of trouble. People were fighting on the street, there was noise. And the worst thing for the Americans, the people went to the eastern part of Berlin, to the Russian territory, and because they had 1 hour longer open. And so they had to change this. And Heinz Sellmeier made it happen that the curfew was completely dismissed in Berlin from that point. So since 1949, there is no curfew in Berlin, which also a big driver of a vibrant night in the city. And then, of course, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was a lot of empty space, unused buildings, abandoned buildings that then were taken over by creatives for exhibitions, for parties. The Tresor Club actually opened right between East and West on the former Death Strip. But after a couple of years, this vibrancy that was then created was turning into something different, because you could see this in 2010. This was actually also the year when I started to work for the Club Commission. There was a famous club, the Knack Club, that had to close after 65 years because there was a new building built next to the building. And all we could do is, with famous musicians supporting, this is Stumpen from Knockato, a local band, on stage with us, fighting for why is it not part of city development and planning that clubs also are part of this. So the music scene is not on the map of decision makers at that time. And we organized protests. So you can see me here circled in the middle next to David Hasselhoff. He was visiting, supporting us, and having a press conference. So you can see, I mean, that was also quite a fun way of drawing attention. We got all the newspaper titles in that week, and we had 10,000 people protesting. Also, Roger Waters from Pink Floyd showed up, and I don't know what I'm doing there in the back, probably taking selfies. But you can see, protesting and creating awareness was a big part of my job as a spokesman of the Club Commission. I was also then speaking the first time in front of the Cultural Committee of Berlin, and for actually the first time somebody was talking in front of that committee about club culture. That was not an issue before in the Cultural Committee of the Berlin Senate. And so speaking with the press, creating awareness was, of course, an important part of it. But we also learned that we have to organize ourselves better, bring people together. So the Club Commission was, from the beginning, in these times, creating more and more to a strong lobby. So this is the team at the moment. I would not be able to do such an amazing job for the city by myself. We have a big board, about 15 people. We got actually election day yesterday, and thanks God I got re-elected with a great team of now 15 people who do this voluntarily, and then another 12 who are in our office supporting our work. And because in Berlin this work was also a bit, I would say like a model for other cities. I started to collaborate more and more with Mirek Milan, the former night mayor of Amsterdam, because he also created a global movement of mayors of the night that were appointed in major cities. And so we joined forces and created a consultancy that is called Vibe Lab. And so now at the moment, I'm doing my advocacy, voluntary work at the Club Commission. I'm doing consultancy with Vibe Lab, and I also create studies and work in research in the night. And I will also talk about this study, Creative Footprint, in a second. So all over the world, this movement is, you see, mayors appoint night mayors, people discuss, are on stage. Today, this is also a good example how this spark took over in many cities all over the world. And what we needed to have is more data, because to argue from a emotional point of view, it's not enough for making tough decisions about budgets, about changing laws. So we need to have more data information. So we conducted two studies. One was with Harvard University, with Andreina Sayas, who is also part of our team, and we created a study about this kind of advocacy, nighttime advocacy, and analyzed 40 to 50 cities in that time about this idea of a night mayor or night commission. And then we also did a study that is called Creative Footprint to measure the creativity and not just the economics of night and of culture in the city. And this is a part we did together with the University of Pennsylvania in Berlin, New York, and Tokyo. We also launched a website, a blog basically on nighttime.org and published all the different organizations online. There are more than 60 now. You can see them also in different colors. The ones which are in a darker blue are outside government, and the one with the lighter blue are positions inside government. So this is also a decision that needs to be really been made locally in the city. What is the best model for my city to represent the night, to represent the creative community? Of course, there's so much to talk about. So the nighttime governance is looking into safety issues, into tourism, creative industries, all the nighttime transportation. Is there still like a public transportation after midnight happening? Grants and funding, the big topic about diversity and inclusion. So you see, this is not something that one person can do on her or on his own, together with maybe one person in the city department. You need to have a big team, and you also need to have people on both sides working collaboratively together. And we also see that this is an international trend. So when the UN published, I think 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, where 210 cities all over the globe joined and committed to these goals, we could see that a lot of these goals, of these 17 goals, actually 9 of them aligned very much with the work that we are already doing. So for instance, the Sustainability Development Goal number 3 is about good health and well-being. So everything around harm reduction, safer sex, substance use, mental health, safety at an event is something that we are working on intensively, and it's definitely a goal that we can share with many other cities in the world. It's the already talked about gender equality and social inclusion topic, which is already touching 3 of the Sustainability Development Goals. Then about sustainable resource usage, which is a big topic with the Friday Future movement and everything which comes together, what our part of the progressive scene at festivals and clubs can be contributed to this. I already mentioned mobility, public space. Who owns the city, basically, is a question that we need to raise, and is also defined in these 2 goals in the SDGs. And then finally, promoting creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship. So really creating partnerships across national borders and create public-private civil partnerships. And our recipe for creating a nighttime economy, to create a vibrant night, is basically 3 different pillars. It's you have to have a creative community, people that think different, are non-conform, that are creating a content, and but for this to create content, you have to have the capacity. You have to have a creative space that is affordable and accessible in your city, that you can also rehearse, perform, and also experiment, and maybe also fail once in a while with your project. And then you have to have the right framework conditions. And I talked about this before. So it's a nighttime transportation. I mean, how can people actually commute in the city if there's not a bus after midnight or a train running? But also grants, funding, availabilities, getting a license to do something on public space is also important. So the framework conditions are so important to create this vibrant night and to create a nighttime economy. And when I talk about nighttime economy, I'm always talking about 3 dimensions. So there is a monetary dimension, of course, because people are employed, making money, and create tourism and all these kind of things. But there would not be tourism and money being made if there would not be a social and an aesthetic dimension. To create a really authentic night, You have to have a curated program. You have to have an idea how your space look like. And also you have to have an open mind towards certain communities that you want to involve in your space, to give them a safe space, or even for neighbors that are in the same neighborhood. And this is like the ecosystem of the night. So in the middle, you have the arts, performing arts, visual arts, music, sound, and film and video. And then the more you go out of the circle, the arts get commercialized from let's say from a small gallery or a small live music venue to a mainstream disco. Or to a mainstream label or whatever. So it's also about which part of the ecosystem do you really have to support, that you also create new sounds and new developments, and which of the stakeholders here you can see can survive on their own in a market, in a free market. And these decisions need to be discussed or need to be made by advocates. And I already talked about these different positions that are being created all over the world. They have different names, but all have the same goals and same obstacles. And the obstacles are for nightlife venues all over the world pretty much the same. You have to deal with different level of politics, different level of administration. You have usually somebody who rents the space to you, the real estate developers who want to make money more and more. It's getting reevaluated. And then you have to deal with all kinds of public and internal communication that you need to take care of. So for us to create change, in a city is basically a 5-step approach. First, you need to get inspiration. Get inspiration from other cities. What are they doing? Invite people to talk about, and also visit cities with maybe a small delegation to look behind the scenes. Then you have to create awareness in your city. Start campaigns, panels, symposia, and art interventions to create awareness about the problems and the challenges you face in your city. Third, you have to have numbers. So assessing the city, know your data, bring people together in focus groups, analyze what is going on to really know what you're talking about. And then the step is to create access to public, to the media, to create a position like a night advocate, night mayor, club commission. And then you can create partnerships, you can apply for funding, and you can open doors towards decision makers. And then finally, everybody needs to educate it on the city side as well as on the nighttime operator side. So workshops, expert sessions, consulting, etc., is a big part of the work for the upcoming years. And when we talk to cities, everybody says no in the beginning, but no for us is also the first step to yes. So in Amsterdam, for instance, Mirik, my partner at you.The Lab, he introduced 2013 24-hour permits. So there are now clubs and venues able to open up 24 hours, which creates such a huge impact on how how Amsterdam got back on the map of nightlife all over the world. He also introduced a square host program that would take care of nuisances, of violence and noise in the city center on the Rempleinsplein, which is a nice project because it's a collaborative project between the cities and the nighttime operators to make the square more safe and also reduce violence and nuisances. In Berlin, we started a campaign to get funding from the city for pop culture. It's called Music Board, and which started with 1 million is now more than 4.5 million actually on funding availabilities for the arts, for pop music, and for the infrastructure of music. So also the Club Commission gets supported by the Music Board of Berlin. And another interesting project was born in Berlin. It's a soundproofing fund, which is a 1 million fund created by the city to help small grassroots venues to protect against conflicts with neighbors. So making clubs, venues soundproof is something very expensive, and the city is now having money and budget to support it, and the Club Commission is taking care that this money is also distributed in the right way. Other work that the Club Commission is doing is a yearly kickoff where we invite politicians on stage. Lisa can talk about this a lot. We created a model space project where we looked into the free open airs and the spontaneous scene of the city that is non-commercial and uses public space for their gatherings. We do a yearly party event for our employees in clubs, access all area. Last year, we had, for the first time, a European club night, where more than 30 clubs from Europe were joining Berlin clubs with an event. So this was an amazing program. That was a great collaborative work supported by the Foreign Office of Germany. And then, which turned out as a huge project during the lockdown earlier this year, is United We Stream, a project that is actually started here in my living room with some phone calls. Today, it is nearly 100 cities that were joined this project. We raised more than 1.5 million euros in donations, and we had more than 2,000 artists on stage in more than 450 venues all over the world, creating a digital club, probably the biggest digital club in the world during the pandemic. And also, this was also a bit light on the horizon, is the Day of Club Culture that was introduced together with the Senate for Culture in Berlin on October 3rd, on a very tough time of the year or very tough time in history, probably, for us, that we have this kind of recognition. And Center for Culture also provided almost €500,000 to make this event happen. Other work that we did during the lockdown was starting the blog on April 5th to inform all over the world what are the cities doing, responding to the crisis, so informing each other, bringing everybody together virtually and discussing the different topics. And this led to a project that is called the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan. It's a collaborative project that is led by these people that you can see here. But now more than 130 people joined this project, and we published now 3 chapters. And that worked by gathering information all over the world, filtering what is relevant for the cities, and then organize it in different chapters and share this information globally and discuss it with different stakeholders. So really to get this foot in the door in decision-making and budgets that are now being created during the crisis, that we also get the global nighttime recovered again. So if you're interested in these studies, they are free to download on nighttime.org. We have 3 chapters. One is about the outdoor use of space. The second one was focusing on the indoor, the future of dance floors idea. And then finally, the last one that was on 24-hour cities and how to make them more resilient, and how can, for instance, public transportation and light can make cities safer and more accessible. And 4 more chapters are actually coming up, talking about income and money that is needed to provide it by the governments, but also about nighttime advocacy and how to use data. This is a project where also the Fraunhofer Institute and Penn Press is involved. And as I also mentioned, more than 130 people globally. And now finally, almost my last slide, we are also at the moment working on rapid testing, because again, Nightlife can work as a community and provide safe spaces by providing rapid testing for a fair price. So at the moment, we're planning several centers all over the city that we can make sure that people get tested during this transition time in the next month, and and be a community player, because I think the key to a successful urban planning and the nighttime governance is collaboration. So if we can create change and implement ideas only if we can work together and work as a community closely together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lutz, for this presentation. You're pretty good around timing. You have 2 minutes left more.
Great. So I have 2 minutes for answers.
Yeah.
Great.
So, how should we proceed? Should we take the questions in? Okay, sure. So, do you have anyone in mind next, or should we like talk about the presentation with Lutz a little bit to go over my notes? Okay, yeah. So like it's really interesting what you said, because it 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 shows that in order to have a thriving nightlife, you have like those um, historical event who happened with the end of the curfew in World War II, like after World War II, to help who helped create a friendly environment for nightlife. You had also this new 24-hour license in Amsterdam. All those things will help creating a more sustainable nightlife. And I feel like it's also like a thing about image and recognition, which are like the questions that we have. And how do we determine, so like how do we determine this influence and explain this to local lawmakers that you already kind of explained with project developer, landowner, and neighborhood communities. And like if there is anything we can learn from other actors who have more experience with in liaising with the stakeholders. So I don't know if you want to answer it, Lutz, or anyone want to jump into those questions. So yeah, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I just start so we get maybe a bit conversational, and please everybody join in. So what we try to do is kind of having this, having this kind of a lot of actors in nightlife, a lot of topics that need to be discussed, a lot of conflicts and also competition in between stakeholders. And we try to kind of organize this a bit and make it more accessible for people to understand first how complex the situation is, but at the same time, what are like steps that you need to take one after another to really create change. And what we could see in many cities that were creating kind of a night mayor position, sometimes the ambition was very good because they thought, oh, we need to do something. But then this position was a lame duck. It was kind of a person that was a marketing representative for the city. And I think we have to look at the profile that needs to be used for every city, but also where do we want to place this person? Do we want to place it inside government? But then you also have the problem that this person is not very strong as a figure that you want to, that can maybe be a bit rough and protest and stuff like that. You cannot do this if you're part of the government, But on the other side, if you're outside government and you don't have any funding and support, it's also very tough. So it needs to be, the middle ground, and it's not really easy. And I would like to hear a bit maybe from your experience in your cities or in your field that you're working, how you approach this to really create change and what is the best setting actually.
Does anyone want to jump in? Yeah,
I can jump in. I'm living in Lisbon at the moment, which does not have a night mayor or anything really kind of remotely similar. But I lived in the UK for 14 years. I just moved back to Lisbon this summer, and we have a night mayor there. And actually, you're the way that you approach the subject of finding someone that feels like actually does something it really made me think of the current night mayor in London. And actually, I think it can be detrimental to the idea. Like, it's not just, oh, we need to find someone that is really great. Is that if you don't find that, you then have this wave of alienation. And people just kind of, currently in the UK, there is very much the feeling of like, what is this for? Because you have a night mayor that, I don't know, 4 days ago was doing tweets about going into a venue with Prince Charles and the Duchess of wherever, which is, not entirely helpful. and highly performative. And I think you need someone that, instead of bringing royals into venues to create awareness, maybe should pressure the royals to give some of their money to save actual venues. So it's kind of like, you need a bit more of like a radical approach to approach these positions, because like you said, you need to have, if you don't have this feeling of moving things forward, then you fall into the trap of performative, and then people just see it as another sort of political name that doesn't really sound like it does much. So that's really key.
Can I ask you, there is also a night mayor in Manchester, Sasha Lord. Have you heard about him?
Yeah. He's definitely a lot more active, for sure.
No, I'm saying, no, there are, it's also, depending on the person, of course, but also if you're inside or outside government. And Sasha Lord he's an event promoter, so he's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And he's much more free to create things. So maybe that's also a bit of the frame.
Then it needs to be a bridge between someone who's actually in touch with these communities, who actually knows what the communities need, that isn't commodifying the position, which I feel like has happened in the case of the night mayor at the moment. And people have access to how much these people get paid, and then it just sort of creates this vacuum. And I've really felt that with COVID, where people were really hoping for some sort of leadership, someone to speak on their behalf, and that it definitely felt like the disconnect was there. So it's really key to find someone that isn't perfect, not looking for someone that's perfect, but someone who has a grasp for what the communities are actually, looking for.
Yeah, like essentially, like to find out how do we strive for more equal social condition for artists and people employed in nightlife, and how we can achieve that. And for example, you said like the night mayor in Lisbon wasn't really active, wasn't really proactive and to pushing things.
In London.
In London wasn't really proactive into pushing things, and more like tweeting about like bringing up awareness with using celebrity this kind of stuff. And it kind of remind me of the same situation in Paris back in the day. We had a night mayor, and I'm not sure if we still have one, but it was also this kind of profile. We really strive into like, okay, raising awareness through celebrity and so on, but not really pushing things forward. Do anyone want to jump into like into how do we strive for more equal social condition for artists, like as a either night mayor or like as an organization or something? Feel free. Maybe Jonas or Lisa.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit indeed. Maybe it's good that somebody else answers this one, because it's not really my field, so I leave it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a bit similar. I'm coming more from, let's say, the research side, so not from the organizatory side. So I have a hard time answering a question about equal social rights for people working in club culture.
On power localing. Yeah, go ahead, Lutz.
Yeah, I think it is a topic that has different layers that you need to look into. One is, of course, creating awareness about it, because it's also not being discussed. We are also running clubs and venues, and people get badly paid, or let's say skyrocketing paid when you look on the artist side, on the other side. So I think it's not so easy to talk about this topic during the crisis, because everybody is suffering at the moment, and to bring this into the conversation, like everybody in this economy or in this field is now really in a big threat. So, but basically it starts with the awareness, and also then bringing this to the discussion on a political level, what can be supported and changed. Because what you can also see is we did studies, and we could see that venues that are into curating program and also in experimentation, maybe also focusing on a certain niche, they don't really make profit with their venues, you know, and other ones are basically, you know, opening up a venue, playing top 40 hits, bottle service, and then you make a ton of money. So it's also about looking really into the programming and the content to make decisions who you can support as a government and who you need to support as a government. And I try to show this with my ecosystem graphic to see how this ecosystem looks like. But it's nothing that you can decide just like this. It needs to be looked into and also kind of make a matrix or a clarification who is which venue is into which kind of curation and which is not.
Yeah, this is where you did also the data for advocacy for the footprint to learn about the creativity of certain clubs and who's doing what. Because yeah, if we just take it as a bulk and we'll just, okay, we're gonna put funding into this bulk of clubs, and then you end up helping like the normalization of clubbing being the same thing everywhere, as you showed like in the presentation, then it's not relevant. So yeah, we have to take into that aspect. Does anyone want to push further into that direction?
Yeah, I would like to give it to Lise, because she is she's working exactly on this idea to create free space for the art, and maybe that's your topic.
Okay, go ahead, Lise.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you. I was indeed looking, and I think like, hey, wow, this is really the advocacy part, you know. Industry also so very important. Largely through my work, what I did normally in Berlin, but was also really focusing at, you know, self-organization, youth culture, urban space. So how are we going to create space for conflicts that are happening in the city because of them growing? And in this kind of sense, you know, I think there really what we see, you know, the work we do is like more like thinking, how can we get actors to work together? I think Luke's also really in his presentation say collaboration is very important element, but this is exactly the element of distrust that is there, that really causes a lot of people not to work together, especially if you're talking about free open airs or self-organized scenes. So it's a lot about bridging actually examples and drawing it into a bigger perspective. For example, in Amsterdam, we just implemented a free space policy in the city of Amsterdam, which is really a large struggle, because there you have an ADM community, which was one of the most biggest, amazing communities still there, but was evicted 2 years ago. And by that, you have a whole squatting scene in the city already for years discussing its own identity. You know, we have nightlife clubs, but this is actually also a part of nightlife. Why? I go to Amsterdam and Berlin, not only to go to clubs or to venues, but because of the fact that there's a lot of spontaneous stuff happening everywhere, basically. And I can go to a club, but I can end up in an open air, you know, on Sunday after day. So yeah, what to do? And very importantly, the city also there started to look, how can we get actors together? This is a huge challenge. Yeah, so you have squatters that are just evicted, and then you have a city saying, we are going to create a new policy. We're going to create space. And we have a lot of people that just lost their spaces. So we came in there with our project a little bit like, whoa, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to have all those people speaking the same kind of language? This is impossible. But actually, the fact that they have never been talking really properly in this kind of setting, or people feel that they're really listened to, this was a huge challenge. But funny enough, all through the process, and I cannot say that everybody is involved in that, of course, because there's many variations, to having a really accurate participative process between people in shaping such a policy or development, people start to really slowly understand each other, build trust. And funny enough, you can see that even a policy for self-organization of free space then can be possible. So I think it's a lot about the process and how you approach things and how you bring people together.
Mhm.
And in that kind of sense, I believe that is a good practice, what we have now in Amsterdam, which you should share with many cities.
Mm.
Because, yeah, nightlife, but there's indeed a lot of people that are young.
Yeah.
Like me, I was also like this. I want to participate.
Yeah.
I don't want to consume. I want to like play records
Yeah.
myself. I want to be a collective. And we need to have a really healthy balance in cities that all is possible. But that's also part of club culture and nightlife. So
Yeah.
a little bit in that kind of sense. I think this is a little bit the field of work that I'm here coming into.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's a major part also of what Lutz is doing. And
Yeah.
looking at these strategies, getting them across, and like with that, easing the trust that, hey, you can trust this kind of people. They're pretty responsible, you know.
Yeah.
So that kind of sense, yeah.
You want to jump in, Karin, because that's also your kind of field, and I want to ask the question like, what do we consider to be a nightclub? And that's perfect because you talk also about how we difference between a commercial investor-driven club and a community-instigated project. So yeah, I want to expand into those questions. If you can please jump in, Karin.
Yeah, my work is primarily booking artists and kind of doing tours sort of around the world for a few years now. And I've had experience also, like I was a promoter for many years, a small promoter, quite DIY. And so I have kind of this wide experience of putting events on in smaller spaces and then seeing that develop over the course of 5 years or so. And then through my agency work and my experience there, kind of seeing the behind the scenes and the actual, the numbers behind a lot of that, like in the different cities. And I'm not sure that what makes a difference between a nightclub that is community funded and corporate funding is, I think it shows in the programming, number one. I think it then has an impact on the people that will be in the spaces, because it will have an impact. It's kind of all just a domino effect of, depending on the programming, you are inviting people in. As a promoter, as someone who's curating, that's your invitation. That's your postcard that you're sending to people and saying, hey, come into this place. And then there's a filtering process that happens through ticket prices, through the way that you promote it, through which channels are you using to promote these things. And I guess then that in that process, that's where you kind of can tell which kind of, if it's a community-driven thing or if it's a corporate thing.
No.
I find it difficult to not be more towards community-driven things, because that's kind of where I've come from. And also as someone who consumes culture, you know, I was going to squatters parties and hardcore parties when I was like 14. That's where I find that there's the most creativity. It's where you can really tell that once there isn't the pressure of profit, culture tends to, you know, have a better ground to actually flourish, because it's you don't have the gaze of capitalism so close to you. And then in these more corporate spaces, you do get a sense of like it just being more insipid and maybe not as creative because it has been kind of more commodified. But across the board, both are imperfect in different ways, I would say, because nightclubs depend on very problematic industries, such as the alcohol industry and all of that. So I find I struggle to kind of try and do like a purity test over what is best or not, because all of them are imperfect. I think it's about which of them have the most or long-lasting impact in actual culture.
Yeah, that's great, because that's literally my next question. So how to create local impact with cultural actor, administration, and the local politicians or political agents. So yeah, how do we do that? Can you expand on that? And all of you guys are invited to answer.
I can jump in a bit more if you want. I think it's all about, I think one thing that was very apparent from the beginning and throughout Lutz's presentation was that you can't do anything without a basis of collaboration. You know, without a collaboration, without extending a hand to maybe actors that you wouldn't know, like, you accept that you don't see eye to eye, but you have to cross that bridge somehow.
Yeah.
I'm in the process of becoming less skeptical. I don't particularly have a personal history of trusting governments to work in the interest of communities. It's not something that I hold my breath over, but I do recognize that it is very important. But it's like, how do you do that without compromising the actual outcome? Because that there's always interest involved. I only realized this week that this is a bit of like a side note. I've been watching, I don't know if you watched Treme, the HBO show, the David Simon show, and actually it was only yesterday that I realized how deeply it connects to this conversation, because it's about, you know, post-Katrina, New Orleans, and in lots of ways it has resonated with me, and like, oh, this is kind of, it could draw a lot of parallels to the COVID situation with Katrina and like the people who are the most affected by it, etc. But then an element of it is about the music and about the spaces, because you have a lot of developers that sort of come in and obviously profit out of you know, the misfortune of many, usually, you know, Black people historically. And even with the best of intentions, there's always an underlying feeling of interest. So I don't know where maybe Lutz and Lisa have more experience on the ground of like, where do you find the common ground when you know that you're sort of sitting in opposite lines in terms of your intention? So yeah, that's where I'm at. Yeah, I don't have an answer.
No. It's important to ask question also.
Yeah.
No, I think Lisa and I, we can both say a lot about this, but I think it's also something that you have to make your own experience. And I think I did workshops all over the world. I think Mirik and I, we traveled about 100 cities and had workshops and talks. And it's very different to talk to politicians in, let's say, Nordic countries in Scandinavia, or to talk to politicians in Sao Paulo. You know, so or even doing a workshop with stakeholders and politicians in both countries shows how much mistrust, bias, whatever there is, and it's also something that needs to be built up over years. This trust. It's nothing that you can just start, and it's very important to look what are the different interests of the decision makers in that position. But I think before you come to that point, you at least should try to build trust in understanding if this person has all the information. You know, if the person you're talking to has now no information or very little information, there is also a lot of misunderstanding built on that. And then there is there is corruption and racism and whatever there is layers on top. But I think you have to work towards that to find out, you know, what are the different interests. And we can see that in Berlin, we have now a very left-wing government. And the people that we are talking to in the Senate, we used to be in the opposition 15 years ago. And we kind of accompanied them and we know them. And now they still are in a position that they cannot say, okay, we build a nightclub, or we do everything in public space for free, and we get all the tax money into the grassroots venues. They're not doing this because they also have different frames that they're in, and they also need to get re-elected from certain stakeholders. So there is something you have to find. But I think this is also what a city society is about. You need to kind of negotiate all the time, and there needs to be kindergartens and shopping for elderly, and there needs to be restaurants and bars, and it's something, you have to find the mix, and that's democracy. That is what you really would like to have, this kind of dialogue. But if you don't have any voice, if you don't get your shit together and create a manifesto, create a plan, and create what you actually want, then also politicians don't know, and you're not the first election group that they're reaching out to. You're not in their focus usually. So yeah, I think you should give definitely the try. But I also understand that what you said, Katrina, this is on the long run. It's not something that you can change from now.
Yeah.
But Lisa, you probably also we had events at the Chamber of Commerce together. So we said there's a devil at the table. So I mean.
I have one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Liz.
I have one point to add to that. Indeed, because I completely. You also said like, hey, where does the DIY culture stays DIY? And there's many risks in if you have involvement, for an instance. And I completely with you. I was a squatter before for many years, so I have a very natural way of not always respecting authority. But in this kind of situation, sometimes when we have to move on or create sustainable frameworks, and people know it already because there's no more spaces, you need to also make compromises in that kind of sense. And I think that's kind of awareness is already with many people in many cities clear. And the thing is a little bit, I believe that it's essential in how governments can help in leaving something as much at the core identity as it is. I mean, we all have this whole conversation about urban resilience, about being a resilient city, and how do we get resilient spaces. And I think it's getting much more, and nightlife in total, much more clear to governments that also, for an instance, just take the example of Amsterdam. The only thing the city needs to actually do, in my opinion, is look what space they have, look how they can lower restrictions for the use of the space, and give the space to people so they can actually grow themselves and start to develop. And I think basically that's the only thing a local government should do, is create the conditions for this, that it can grow by itself. And what is a problem in many cities, or I think in Amsterdam largely what destroyed the city also years before, is that everything was built on concepts. A concept for this, a concept for that. People were writing in there. Like, I think it indoctrinated a whole youth generation that the words produce was more important than the road towards it. And I think we can learn a lot from this element and experiment at least with it in cities by saying, hey, government, let's turn it around. You should be a facilitator. Get off the content and let people, give them the space, and we'll see from there. So in that kind of sense, I'm a little bit hopeful that if we create frameworks that are holistic for local governments, where they see that they just need to facilitate room for the self-organization, stay off the content, but just create the right policy that allows it to grow, I believe we have a different discussion. So that's something I want to say, because I really fear this. Yeah, if you want to answer. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to do a side note of that. I just left a country that's been under Tory rule for 10 years. So I'm like in that process of leaving that trauma behind. So I hope to feel more hopeful sometime soon. But it's a bit hard when you've lived somewhere where the country's getting sold wholesale, you know.
So I want to, go ahead.
I think it's just about taking that examples, showing them that it is possible, and now it's waiting. We believe in our own culture in this sense, that we are able to be responsible with the use, and we are able to show it. So I hope these good practices will grow and we can multiply a little bit. Sorry,
The thing is, like, that's good that you talked about the issue with being under a conservative government. We gave a huge toll to the nightlife, and also the fact that there's like this thing of like having a concept for everything. So like, this is the night area, this is the commercial area, and so on. And what can we, so the question is like, what can we learn from club spaces in other countries, like for example in Georgia, in Tbilisi, or in Italy, where there is no governmental support? So how do we learn from organization and resilience from there? Yeah,
should I answer this?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So yeah, with this project we are now doing, the space of urgency, we try to see what are those communities, or we're building this research right now, doing in order to survive, because they have almost zero governmental support.
Yeah.
And I think it is really interesting if you look at Berlin, Amsterdam, or spaces there, during the pandemic, how do places, there's amazing framework like United We Stream, for an instance, from Berlin, and you see that there's a lot of donations there in Berlin, really, because people really believe in the solidarity, because the scene and the spaces are really community driven, they're political, they have a value system, and it's different than where you have discussions in cities right now where communities are standing up against the spaces, like, hello, this is not a safer space. I think also the local support is completely different for that spaces. So I think the element, if you're a commercial space, a disco, or a nightclub or whatever, is really different how resilient you are, because I believe this resilience is a lot in the community effort, the people around it supporting each other, and also making solidarity. So why is the space in Macau, for an instance, in Italy, or in Tbilisi also still there, has to do with a lot of diplomatics, of course, of people, but it also has to do with the solidarity. So people really become a movement, go out and really protect the space. So I think this is a time to really look at strategies that people are doing and learning from it, and seeing how can we also actually learn from that spaces, why they are so resilient. So the commerciality versus the community-driven space, I think that we can learn from nightlife a lot of, to maybe rethink how can we grow that kind of spaces, and the spaces also now, like, strengthen them, but also see how can we create a kind of bed for them for future generations. And I believe it comes back to self-organization, because resilience means how adaptive you are against the challenges, and we all know strong communities, movements. This is very important. Yeah,
I think with community stakeholders, you definitely have a better chance at surviving. And I think you can already see that in a lot of ways with this sort of growing trend of crowdfunding. That is definitely, I think, something that next year we'll see a lot applied to these spaces. And then maybe through that, there can start more of a conversation about community stakeholders and people really feeling like they are a part of these spaces in some way, because they did put some of their money into it. And maybe through doing that, that conversation starts. So, yeah.
But it's also limited. I mean, you see cities that are, they're so skyrocketing rents. You look to London, New York, Paris. There is also a limit in self-organizing, and if the next shopping mall developer is buying your property, you're gone. So I think it's also, you have to have this dialogue with politicians. There's no other way. This needs to be part of your strategy to play a role in the political discussion, and you also have to find supporters. When we started our first campaign, we also talked to companies like Native Instruments or Ableton, because we said, you're tech and you're also gentrifying, but you have an understanding why it's so important to have a city that is vibrant, and that to have these spaces, and so you need to find partnerships that you have a stronger voice towards decision makers.
I agree. It's a combination. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonas.
No, I agree also. I mean, coming from a bit of a different context from Leuven, which has a vibrant nightlife, but is a very small city, it's a student city. And here you can also see that basically in the last 30 years, there has been a decrease of all these alternative types of nightlife. They are all replaced by commercial systems. And it's only now through the advocacy of a young group of people called Nightplan that they are advocating for a nightclub, and a nightclub which is different from all the bars we have, because we have a lot of bars. We have a 24-hour bar. Bars are open 24 hours, so it's not the problem that there's no access to nightlife. It's just that it's a very mainstream field. And I was thinking, in our case, and I guess it's in most of the cases, it's really important to, in this discussion with policy, to stress this social and aesthetic components very much, because I have the feeling that they are very, not necessarily open, but they are listening, at least when this group of this youth group, which is, because I want to give them the credit, when they are knocking at the door and saying that we need something different for us, not something which is there for the mainstream. And I mean, that's maybe something I want to kind of bounce back, because for me as a researcher, standing a little bit with having a little bit of distance from this phenomenon, I find it a very interesting field of tension between a group of, let's say, a very bottom-up organized group that really wants to do a DIY, but that needs to immediately go to the city in order to even just start. Because in Leuven, we have this problem, it's an historical problem with skyrocketing rents. So from the start, there's no other solution than going through to the city, going through all the systems of policy. And I'm always wondering, like, how will it affect the outcome? Because we're still in the process of creating a club. We don't have this yet. And so that's kind of, for me, that's a very interesting field. You see that there are policymakers which are progressive, which really want to help, but still, I mean, there's always a boundary. They cannot just say, like, do whatever you want. They have to find, there's some limits, there's some policies that need to be followed. So yeah, I kind of want to, most of you have probably more experience with this. I want to see how you thread that line between, let's say, sustainability, support from the government on the one hand, but keeping this kind of, this transgressive element, which is always there, alive.
Yeah. If anyone want to answer this real quick?
I can maybe relate to it a bit. I think when you talk to governments, it's always good to have a critical distance, but to be constructive. That means if you are only in a protest situation, you won't have, you will maybe get attention, but it's not like that they want to talk to you and want to solve your problem, because you don't really, it's not a really nice atmosphere to work together with people who are only protesting. So having an organization that has a clear vision, politicians can handle better, because then they can say no because, and cannot just, you know, if it's too blurry for them, they don't really know how to interact with that. So I think from the idea to be really to have a distance to decision makers, but at the same time have a plan, can also lead to something different in the end, because you get maybe publicity, maybe there is this group of I don't know, more holistic approach of people who say maybe we should gather some money together from different sponsorings or different partnerships that are out there. Maybe what happens in Berlin after a Degreesmühle protest that we had earlier this year, there were real estate developers popping up and say, hey, we actually have a rundown project here, we would really like to host you there. So there are also possibilities, but to address first your ideas, to basically to society, because politicians are representing the society, I think it's the first step. And then you have to negotiate and see if you completely rely on government and tax money, or are there other options that you can move forward with.
Yeah, thank you. I wanna jump into the other set of questions, because like we talked about clubs, so I want to dive more into the environment of clubbing and the dance music industry as a let's say as a safe space, or not so safe space place. And I want to ask, so with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the discussion that happened within the dance music industry, who got heightened up by the COVID crisis and what happened in Minneapolis, what measure can nightlife community take to educate their members, visitor, on how the music is an expression of feeling outed by oppressed community, and what can employee, volunteer, or other who might feel alienated without actual decision-making power in organization, can help to like instigate changes, and what places can do to do better. So yeah, if anyone wanna answer, we can all answer and have a conversation toward that.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
Well, these are big questions, because I think the problem is structural, and it's far beyond the nightclub and the nighttime economy. It's deeply ingrained. So I think education needs to be at the very, foundation of all of these, potential changes. But within the spaces of nightclubs and events and all of that, I think that there just needs to be, this education element. You as like someone who if I'm someone who's organizing parties, or I've run a nightclub and all these things, being in this situation where there is this topic that's talked about, I think there is a momentum to actually, you're not pulling this conversation out of nowhere. There is something that is happening right now, and you as an organizer should be utilizing this and be like, right, how can I best educate my staff and the people that I work with? Because also through doing that, you can kind of see if you receive resistance to the topics or not. And then from that, you can make your own decisions about, am I working with enough Black people? Am I actually just breaching the topic because it's being talked about? Or do I actually want to create some fundamental changes in the structures that I operate in? So I think it's essential for this education element to be a part of events, nightclubs. And I think doing that, and I know, luckily, there are promoters that I speak to kind of around the world that have started sort of training processes with their staff, looking not just at the history of the music that they usually have at the club, just to kind of be like, this is a nightclub, but like, let's get a bit deeper into what that is, and what has historically been, like, what has it been for? And in that process, also learning themselves. And I'm, it's not, I don't think it's happening at the speed that that would be ideal. I think in June, everyone was in this sort of like, right, we're going to change everything. But then also you've got a backdrop of chaos of like a global pandemic, and priorities get mixed up, I suppose. But yeah, I can see that there is an effort in doing that, and through doing that, then it's already having some impact on the conversations that then I have more, like my side is kind of as an agent where I'm speaking about lineups. And I think that education just makes you just keep it in mind at all times. And if you don't have that, it's just, I think people just struggle to think on where to start, because there's an element of shame in admitting that you haven't done enough. So I think that's the sort of first obstacle that you have to jump through. Remove your ego from the situation and focus on educating yourself and those that you employ, to then hopefully see like a knock-on effect. But I'm sure it's a different experience for everyone in here.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to it from like what you talked about, like a systemic issue. The project, the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan that we were working on since May, June this year, showed us also how everybody all over the world is affected by this crisis, but it's really hard to involve people from the global south in such a project, because they are just less organized as you have them in Europe and Northern America and so forth, or also in Asia. And they're also, we're having this as a voluntary project. So every writer, contributor is taking their time and providing information and giving us input. And it's just also for a lot of people just not possible. They have to survive and create income, and they cannot work voluntarily on such a global project. So it is also a systemic issue. And even if we have this approach and we want to include everybody, it is nearly not possible to do this as we should do. So we're really fortunate that a couple of days ago we got granted a project money to do actually research in Senegal, Kenya, and South Africa, but also Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. So we have now some budgets to go in these countries, do focus groups, talk to people, and get the information, and we can also pay them. Which is so essential that you have some budgets to do projects like that. So all I want to say, it's very systemic, and you don't realize this in the beginning because everybody is so hyped up and want to contribute and do and stuff. But they see you're only white people from the global north, and I think that is the awareness is there, but it's also not really easy. There are a lot of obstacles in our work all over the time.
Yeah, and also I think that comes from the fact that there is a lack of intersectionality in the approach to these things. What matters to me here doesn't matter as much to my mom who lives in Mozambique, and it doesn't really resonate with her because the primary thing on her mind is, I want to put food on the table. So it's kind of, you can't approach this in this sort of like blanket thing of, all right, we have to all do this because we're so fragmented. We're like, if anything, the COVID, BLM, all of these things have just pulled the curtain and showed just how fragmented it all is. And through that fragmentation, you're going to have people with different dispositions to actually want to engage, or not just want, but have the headspace to engage with. And whether they want to donate their time to something that ultimately is going to take them a lot of time and effort, but not really work to their profit. So, it's
totally, you're totally right.
Yeah. We're just, capitalism is mummified very deeply, kind of across the board, whether you're rich or poor. And I think it needs to be initially a grassroots thing, and then those grassroots movements trying to like get deeper into like the, I guess, more corporate side of things, and then eventually that has a knock-on effect, because I think personal responsibility alone isn't really gonna take us anywhere.
Yeah, and how do we push, like, within the West, within our club scene, in the clubs, or like with people working in the club, with different gender representation, different background? How do we push to like make something really like safe, and like have like this kind of framework where like, okay, this happened, this microaggression happen, like how do we try to make it possible for like Black or people of color to feel safe within like the club scene. It's like I think it's an important question, and then I guess it will dribble down into like how we collaborate with the global South as well. So in my next question, yeah, like because the COVID crisis, we had like, for my experience, because I was living in Berlin and I came back here. When I was living in Berlin in June, people were doing illegal parties and rave, and like what's your opinion on those events? Or like people who use the loopholes or government ignorance to like organize those events, and how also it kind of like put a dent, I guess, into the trust between the public and the dance music industry, or the dance music industry and the government. If anyone want to jump in on that.
I can do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it was inevitable. Obviously, it was always going to happen. If you tell people not to congregate, they will congregate and they will find a way to do it. I don't particularly. It's kind of a hard one because I personally wouldn't be caught dead in any of these events, but I can kind of understand that there's just a societal disconnect, and there's just this feeling of this being kind of like a transgressive act, and it's kind of an act of rebellion in some way, and anti-government or anti-whatever, depending on where these parties are happening. But that seems to be kind of the underlying, like, we want our freedom sort of chat, which is kind of frustrating because I think to some extent, probably a huge extent, it's going to set us back in a lot of the conversations that we were talking about up until this point. I think people are going to, the people who have no real interest in nightlife are going to very easily weaponize these parties, and that has happened already, and I've seen it happen quite a lot over the summer. It's going to be weaponized and generalized, as like, this is what these people do, and this is what they want, because I think there's just this very real, and I'm not saying it's everyone, but I think in general there's a certain element of looking at the dance floor and people who work in nightlife as this kind of like, bacchanal and like, super Dionysian, we're all just, at the party, just getting our hoo-has on, and this hasn't helped, especially because there's so much footage of exactly that happening. Yeah. Which to people, I guess, translates as dancing on graves. So I think it's going to set us back. It's been frustrating for me as an agent because I'm in this weird place where I've got artists who are struggling because lots of them come from places or are based in places where they don't really get a lot of support, and they depend solely on music to do these things, and they've been trying to do other things outside of music, but then an opportunity arises for what is a legal party, and you have to have this leap of faith that the promoter has everyone's well-being as their first and foremost priority, which everyone can say, but not very many people can actually follow through with. And it's not something that you have control over. The only control is if an artist enters the venue and then they see that it's a mess and nothing is being followed, and they sort of just walk out. which I've advised every single one of my artists to do. Because ultimately, as someone who organizes parties, especially in this period, you have a duty of care to everyone that is in that space. So if the person that you've hired to essentially sell your tickets to people isn't feeling safe in that space, then they reserve the right to exit that space. So yeah, I think we're gonna still have a period of this. I'm bracing myself for this to be the story of the next few months. But yeah, I think it will set us back by a little bit if the sort of like illegal parties continue in the so-called play graves.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not totally agreeing on the motivation. I think the motivation is not to do something illegal because it's rebellious. I think most of the motivation is because there are no legal alternatives. And we also learned in this crisis, we also saw that indoor events are much more critical than outdoor. And I think outdoor in parks without light and without toilets and without structure, hygiene is also more threatening than if you have it in a framework that is kind of learned and organized. So I think if we would, I mean, we worked on that in Berlin, and we were some successful towards the end of the summer, not in the beginning. It took a long time until we got everybody agreeing. But we had some weekends where we had more than 60 events at one weekend, and they were mostly outdoors next to the clubs, on the outdoor areas of clubs. Some of them also on public space that we got provided by districts. People were dancing. They were dancing with masks. If they were not dancing, they had to sit down somewhere and could take their mask off and can take a drink or smoke or whatever. But on the dance floor, it was strictly only masks, no drinks, no cigarettes, because that is kind of the rule that people agreed on. And that worked really well. We haven't had a lot of infections in that time. The infection rate was very low throughout the summer. So I think if you provide legal alternatives, people will choose the legal part. And I think it's also about being also critical towards this. I totally agree with you. We have to also speak out and say, this is not okay in a pandemic to do indoor events illegally, because that is really something that pushes us really bad back. Doing parties in the park, I don't see too critical. Besides, it's really bad PR, and I had a lot of mess in the summertime to respond on press who reach out to me.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant by that. Totally.
Liz, you want to
Yeah, I would like to also add to that. It is really easy to we have to watch out, at least with this, that we say these are party people because of the pandemic and they're out there. I saw a really nice article in Vice actually during this whole ordeal where they showed the 3 different forms of illegal parties that are happening, for an instance, in England. And we know very good, the free techno scene is doing this since forever. That is their way of choice. And we have people, for instance, in Berlin doing free open airs who are collectives and people that are really, this is what they do as a cultural collective. This is how they meet and do. And then you have the people also with the laughing gas balloons and we don't care a fuck and leave all the litter behind. And there is basically this huge non-awareness of values. So that is, of course, also within that scene of this free open air movement and rave culture. Within there is actually a lot of discussion and people are really trying to say, hey, how can we show the good example and the responsibility? So just to feed into that there's really different groups of people giving those events, just for clarification. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. The thing is like how that I want to go further is like how do we create a transnational alliance like within the scene, like for example, we're all based in Europe, so how can we do like alliance with like organization through Europe to like exchange good practice. And yeah, that's basically it.
I'd love to answer this one. Well, what we did was on the day of the lockdown, we didn't have this idea before. We started a WhatsApp group for the Berlin clubs. And we had suddenly, like, I think almost 200 people in that WhatsApp group sharing different topics, especially when it came to applying for funding. For the funding programs, there were so many difficulties, so that it was really helpful to have this group to get informed. But we also did this on a global level. So we also started a global nighttime group that was joined by all the commissions and night mayors. And that was also very helpful. That was actually what led us to the blog nighttime.org and to the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, because we had so much information popping up in these WhatsApp groups that we had to organize them and find out which is relevant for who and get more into it and find out how, you know, how these cities responded. And we, for instance, Vilnius, not a city that everybody knows or have been, was then suddenly in the media about, hey, they were already in June providing public space for bars, restaurants, and basically opened up the streets and public spaces for that, because they understood that indoor is much or less safe than outdoor. And I think that is something that other cities can also get inspired and maybe also challenge, because there is a competition between cities globally, and you can also spark this a bit. You know, you can try to get this this kind of competition going. And we already tried to do this with our work at Vibe Lab, because we always said, if you want to be the city for the next generations, the ones where the engineers and the IT specialists and people like that move to, you have to have a vibrant nightlife, because they don't choose a boring city. So that's already something what we try to kind of spark or to support. And these times it's really helpful to have these groups, to have these kind of platforms, blogs, reports, because it's a base for further discussions. If you use the nighttime recovery plan and go to the city government and you had no contact before, and you said 1, 2, 3, let's have a dialogue about this, and then they have to bring all these people to the table, then you have a basis for discussion, because you can say, hey, city A, B, C, and D already did this and this, why haven't we? You know, you have something that you can discuss about. And I see this a lot, that we don't even know what our neighbors are doing. We don't even know what the next state in Germany is doing at the moment. So information is just missing. And to convince politicians, it's really helpful to know what the next door neighbor is doing, or other countries or other cities are doing. So that's why I think it's very, very important to have this global dialogue.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah. I completely agree with this, and I think indeed these practices really can spark a kind of chain reaction in other spaces or other cities, and really stress also the element of it, indeed, the connection between civil organizations, initiatives, but also really cross-sectorally. So no, I completely agree. It's very important, and I think it really adds to the common discourse. So I completely agree.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do we have a audience question? Yes, perfect.
Yes, to a certain point. I think nightlife is also to be in the countryside. I mean, it's already happening around Berlin in festivals, and they go to these little villages with next to a lake or something, and they start to do their festivals regularly there, and also try to involve the local communities. I think that's one part of the work they do, that they understand they also need to be inclusive in involving the neighborhoods economically, but also from the whole content side and social side. I think it is basically the same idea, to have to keep your young, educated people in your town or small city. You have to have space where they can experiment and create. That what Lisa said. That was also is something that is very much into the young generation of the so-called millennials. They want to be part of the process, not just watching things happening. They want to be in the pilot position, not just in the back seat. And for this, you need to have this kind of space to try out, to rehearse, to practice, to do something. And Dimitri Hegemann, the founder of Tresor, is actually doing a project like this, going to the countryside of Germany, a place where he also came from originally, fleeing from there to Berlin. He goes back there, talks to mayors, and says, if you want to keep the young people here in the city or in the town, you have to provide this kind of space, otherwise they're gone. And I think space is the first issue, and actually Leuven is maybe even also a good example. It's all about accessible, affordable space for your art.
You want to answer this, Jonas, too? Yeah.
I mean, it's true. I think I recognized Leuven very much in the story you were telling. Leuven is a small city very close to Brussels. But still, one of the reasons why I think the policymakers are so interested in this or so open to this is because they see that a lot of young people are fleeing Leuven because of the housing prices, but also because all these alternative spaces are kind of lost. So that's really, I think it's really a challenge to find a way to reintroduce those spaces, and I think that's very, very valuable to not only focus on this, on let's say cities, the huge cities, but also to look at like this periphery and what is happening in the periphery, and how can this periphery and these big cities communicate also. How can they create a very interesting interrelation between each other?
I have I have a really nice story. I was talking to a foundation in New York, and they their main purpose is to bring East and West together to create peace. That's their main purpose for the last 40 years or something. And they changed the narrative now. They say the division is not East and West, the division is countryside and cities. Mm-hmm. And what they do now, and this is a really nice story, which I think is something also we want to learn from it. They brought together farmers from Siberia together with farmers from Montana, because they have similar family structures, they have similar values, they have the same accessibility or not accessibility, and they bring them together and they create an understanding for each culture. And so they had conferences where they exchanged the farmers from Montana with the farmers from Siberia, and they found really big, huge friendships. And I think that is such a good idea to also get like a global understanding, but not just think about people in cities. It's also about countryside. Don't leave them behind. Give them access. And one way of better understanding is also bringing different cultures together from different countries.
Yeah, we have another question from the audience.
Yeah.
No, I can't hear. Okay.
We can't hear you.
I can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Another question that we have from Tina. How would you apply the panel discussion to the topic of integration in multi-ethnic communities?
Does anyone want to jump in?
I can do.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
I think it's a really complicated subject historically, because I think it has historically failed. There is, and actually this sort of connects to, I caught this sort of end bit of what Lutz was talking about there and Jonas were talking about. I think it's great, and we do have to integrate the sort of outer areas into the story of like the development of a nightclub or space story, but then again, we risk commodifying it. And I've seen that in Lisbon, where the South Side, which is where I'm from, has always been sort of kind of removed, but almost by choice. But now the developments in Lisbon have become so great that they are kind of telling this story of embracing the outer limits of the city. But again, it's a story that it's not going down so well because there seems to be a lack of engagement with the local communities. So it's more about sort of like finding the space rather than a real sort of care for the development of those communities. And I think then that's where it links to integration and multi-ethnical areas, because those are usually the ones that are situated in the outer limits of the city. So I think because in general, the impulse to do it is kind of more of a logistical one, then it lacks the kind of actual integration aspect. I'm not sure I think, again, the only way that you can breach that gap, I think, is through actually having the communities as part of just taking ownership of these spaces. What is it that this space can actively contribute to in this community? And I think that's why when we talk about nightclubs, they're wonderful spaces at night, but in the daytime, those spaces are still there. So I'm drawn to the idea of not so much nightclubs, but sort of multi-purpose venues that have this night economy that is, vibrant, but then in the daytime also serves the community in lots of different ways. And I think by having that balance, maybe you can kind of slowly bridge the gap of bias of what these spaces are actually, who these spaces are actually for. But that only happens through kind of having this very deep conversation with these communities and listening to what it is that they need, what this space would be helpful for. And then, only then you can make an informed decision, because otherwise it's sort of like, colonizing mentality of just getting into a space and doing whatever you want from it, but then actually it serves no one that actually lives there, which, is something that we keep seeing happening like over and over again.
Yeah.
No, maybe to connect, I completely agree that it's really important that it's always that you try to find ways to really connect and integrate into this community, because it has to start from this local scene. I think it's very important. And also, one of the things that fascinates me very much about club cultures is that it can amass and it can kind of create this huge amount of effective energy, like this communal energies, which are really, really powerful. And which I think, if all conditions are met, this is not great in itself, but if all conditions are met, they can be really used for very interesting integrational purpose. They can really, if the conditions are right, and it's a big if, then this type of effective energy can really produce a very interesting, I think, feeling of community, which is really going against the very identitarian, or all this just to say that I think there is a lot of potential there if these conditions are met for this type of clubs to play an important role in this type of integration.
Yeah, I really can relate to this, and I urge everybody to read the Creative Footprint study, because we are trying exactly this. So the 15 criteria, the 15 indicators that we are measuring in the creative footprint are looking into the programming of the space, but also into how important this is for a certain community, and also how of course, also economic plays a role, but the main purpose is about the space, the content, and the framework conditions that you have. And we are using actually the creative footprint as an empowerment tool, because we go into those creative communities in focus groups and ask those questions. So that what you say, Katrine, is actually true. You have to go there and you have to activate them. And then you can also feed them with the information, with the data, that they can also then advocate better, because having this data and this information, if your creative footprint is good or bad in your district, is very valuable. And it's just the same idea of, if you're chopping 3 trees, you have to plant them somewhere else to keep it in a balance. It's the same vision that we have with the creative footprint. And we had discussions or a conversation with the Jamaican scene in New York. We had this big discussion in New York about the repeal of the cabaret law, which was very racist, targeting Black communities. We had issues with accessibility in Tokyo that we did, and Lisa knows, in Berlin we have this discussion that is omnipresent, of accessibility, raising the door policies, all this kind of thing. So I think it is an ongoing discussion. I think it can go much deeper and further, but I think we created also awareness, and I think we have to have more data and more evidence-based conversations, which are very essential.
Yeah, and also something that I wanted to add is that there needs to be very clear accountability processes, because obviously it's all very nice and good for us to want to do all this community stuff, but ultimately, if then it amounts to nothing, or if there isn't sort of like a plan to look back, or, you know, again, remove the ego and see where it's not working, and it's kind of, that's the ongoing process in itself as well, because otherwise then you can say you're going to do a lot of things, but then it doesn't really have any follow through, and then you kind of alienate a community which could help you actually thrive as a space. So it's kind of trying to find that good balance between both.
Can we take the next question in? Thank you, Karen.
Yeah. Apparently it's a big topic and it draws big questions as well. One from Philip. Can the post-pandemic period be an opportunity to fundamentally reshape political structures for underdeveloped art and music communities?
Who want to jump in? First one up, saying hi, get the question.
I think there is a big chance. There is a big chance, but I also see in our dialogue that we have that's very different from city to city. For instance, I talked to people in Moscow. They said the pandemic helps them maybe to go back to the city center, because some businesses won't survive, and then there's free space again. For us in Berlin, it is essential that we keep all the space that we have, and yeah, I think it's a very difficult topic from city to city. But what you can say is generally that I think during the pandemic, people are more open to talk to you. In the scene, people get out of their comfort zone and start a dialogue more, be part of the discussion, get out of their bubble. But on the other side, governments tend to listen to you because they know that that's what they know, all of them, because that awareness we created, that nightlife is one of the hardest sectors that been hit. And so at least they get to the table with you. I don't know what it leads to, but I think there is a chance for change, because you can bring people to the table at the moment.
I think there will be some changes. There will be resistance to those changes, because people love the status quo. And I think people will want to, as much as possible or as quick as possible, come into a place where they actually recognize what's around them. And what was around them kind of sucked, but it's what they know and it's how they learned to operate the way they did, where they made profit and all these things. So I think there will be like a friction element of people trying to make those changes and people just trying to, you know, refer back to how things were, because that was fine, because it was working. So, you know, I think that for us who are trying to to kind of ride the wave of the momentum of change, it's going to be, you know, super hard work, but it needs to, it has to be like a sustained attack on the existing structures. I can already see that there's, I agree with Lutz, like there's definitely like an openness since the beginning of the pandemic. There's been like a crazy openness for people to really, you know, open up about their situations and their concerns and all these things. Because I was doing that before, because I'm kind of an open book, and even in something like unionizing, which I've been preaching for years, and I've always been kind of like, you know, haha, Karen, you crazy communist dreamer. Now everyone is sort of like, you know, talking about that maybe it's not so crazy that we're unionizing, because suddenly people have this idea of what their worth is and what it can be. So there's hope as far as those things are concerned, but I don't think that we will arrive at a completely, you know, unrecognizable place after all of this. I think the changes will be, hopefully, you know, they will kind of happen with progressively. But I think we're going to have to try and maintain momentum and keep the pressure on, because otherwise we will kind of defer back to practices that just were simply not working for the kind of greater good.
Yeah. You want to jump in? Yeah, Jonas?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think I mean, I see it in Belgium, there's a lot of seeds that are planted, but they will get squashed if we don't like kind of nurture them once the pandemic is over, because people will want to go back to business as usual. I mean, one of the things I see in Belgium, which I think is very interesting, is that there's a renewed alliance, or at least a renewed dialogue between, what like the traditional arts and club culture, or this kind of creative sectors, which I think is quite interesting for me. For a long time, at least, I mean, I can only speak from like this Belgium and then even Flemish perspective. There was a strong divide between, let's say, dance that you see in a theater and dance that you do in a club. They were kind of completely separate worlds. But now you see that at least both, like at least from the field of the arts, you see that there's much more interest. They take much more interest in questions of, let's say, dance cultures at large. So I have the feeling that due to the pandemic and to the crisis and to the feeling that everybody's in the same boat of precarity, getting underpaid, getting like basically your complete income dropping because of this situation. I have a feeling that there's some interesting dialogue that is, I think, potentially very interesting and powerful, but we will need to kind of maintain once everybody kind of goes back to business as usual.
I would argue that part of that story needs to be that we're not all in the same boat, actually. I would argue that, you know, we're definitely not. I think the Live Nations and the, you know, big WMEs and the Paradigms and all of these kind of big conglomerates are definitely not in the same boat as I am, as a smaller agency that is completely independently funded. And so that needs to be part of the conversation, because there's different, and that's not to say, you know, obviously they did let people go in all of these places, so people have lost jobs, so they have experienced some level of precarity, but I think it will be important to kind of really have this, again, educational approach to this is what the ecosystem is. And within the booking agency world, for example, there are a myriad of different types of booking agency. What is an independent booking agency? What is a boutique? And I think we have done better in the music community. I feel it in providing the information to people. I think people are a bit more aware of how things work, but there's work to still be done there, I think, to people to really understand how it all connects and ultimately where the money goes and what is the flow of the money. Because without some level of like, you know, some level of like distributing wealth a little bit more evenly, we're not gonna get anywhere. And by kind of showing that wealth is already not distributed evenly and that we're not in the same boat as far as that's concerned, hopefully that's gonna give people at least an idea that it's a much more complex, you know, nightlife and the people it employs. It's a very complex, nuanced, you know, educational process that, you know, hopefully people will have some level of interest in. But I also think that we're reaching I think people are a bit fatigued, and I think we need to also keep that in mind, because I was talking about we need to keep momentum, but also there's a fatigue element to it. We can't all just keep going, because then it's like, you know, we can't just be constantly productive.
That's important that you said about we're not all in the same boat, because it's kind of this kind of paradigm that you have in the nightlife is the same that you have in as a producer, as a music producer. You have the people who actually make money out of it through Spotify, and the people who really don't really makes ends meet, and everyone think that everyone is on the kind of same level. And that's kind of like the trickery of the music industry and the dance music industry in general. So yeah, that's important to point out.
And that's a really good example for, I think that the way that people are approaching the subject of artist royalties and something like Spotify and the streaming complex. I think those conversations 2 years ago, they were happening, but they were very niche. And I think that's what we sort of need to do, try and get out of the niche, because now I'm speaking to people who have absolutely nothing to do with music whatsoever, who are friends, who are now kind of seeing more info or these infographics or whatever, however cheesy they may be, they can be informative. And people are coming to me and they know that I work in music, and they're like, oh my God, artists get no money from Spotify. I'm like, imagine that, you know? So I think that's part of the process. It's like, it's great to have these conversations between all of us who are working in this area, but it's extending it to the people who actually buy the tickets to go to these spaces and consume this culture, and try and like not alienate them, make them a part of the conversation, because ultimately they're the ones getting everyone paid, you know?
Yeah, we've got two more different questions coming in. First one is, what's your opinion on the call-out culture that's been on the rise the last months, with most recently the case Peggy Gou and Daniel Wang? And do you think it will change the way clubs book artists?
Does anyone want to? It's a little bit the tabloid question. Does anyone want to answer that?
I know both of them, and I don't. No comment.
We're not the sun.
I mean, I don't inhabit the same universe in lots of ways.
That's a good example of we're not on the same boat, right?
No, we're not on the same boat, and the concerns are personal, and it's not, you know, I don't think they are, you know. Some of the elements are structural. If the conversation was more about, you know, the huge inequality and the massive valley between certain levels of artists and the wealth that they, you know, accumulate. But I don't think that was the purpose of that particular call out. So it'll be a pass.
It will be a pass. And generally the call out, what you can call out like bigger artists for so and so, but like the language in it was really misogynistic. So I think that call out is literally part of the problem. So yeah, it will be a pass. Can we have the next question?
Yeah, last one. It's a very specific one from Simon. Do you believe that a club should be a temporary institute instead of a never-ending business? Because clubs often become too big or mainstream for its core audience in the city itself.
Do anyone want to jump in?
I like this question.
Yeah,
I don't know that I've got an answer, but I think that the both can coexist. I think it is important because I'm not a fan of pedestals, and I think it's important to create the space for the actual spaces to breathe. Because I think it's important to have institutions, of course, but at the same time, the idea of temporary spaces that can have this sort of rotation, that can breathe different life into it, and hopefully then, embrace more different cultures or like a larger breadth of people, it could be interesting. I don't know logistically how that would work, but yeah, even if in this sort of experimental kind of way, I think you see that in some programming to some extent in certain spaces in Europe, especially the types of spaces that are not, for profit. So that's I think it's a great idea, but it would probably be for no profit. So it's always that thing of like, you want to get as many cultures and people involved, but also does that mean that they're not going to get paid in the process and they're just sort of like offering their labor for free? So yeah, I think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it is a vision, but I think it's as long as we're living in this capitalistic system, it's also a bit of a theory and also not very realistic, because the idea that I wanted to create was to create a footprint is the idea of permanently create new space and then also have a change in a city. But this is also something that everybody must agree on, not just city government, but also the private investors, and I think it is a process that we have to get in the heads, because everybody is also benefiting. The city is more vibrant, we have more space for upcoming talent, and also the real estate benefits, because it's also about re-evaluation and gentrification. I'm not saying that this is anything that we want to encourage, but of course we also want nobody be shot on the street and have homeless people on the street. So gentrification has also a certain point of a basis that is also something that we need to achieve when we want to develop our cities. But it's also a tipping point where we have to be very careful of. And so as I agree of having like temporary space as a nice concept, but it's also very tricky that we at one point lose those spaces very fast.
No. Do anyone want to jump in? Lise, Jonas, go ahead. That's our last question, so you can do a commentary as you want.
To add to that, I think it's a lot about the framework indeed where that is possible in. I know that, for an instance, if you look now, again as an example, Amsterdam is looking to make long-term space available, but that the use indeed changes on the space. But it has to do with indeed the right framework on it, how expensive is the space for which initiative. But I generally really support this idea to have space, of course, for the long term. I think Amsterdam is a great city where you see the example of what happened through the broedplaatsbeleid, where clubs were placed in the peripheries without having too much notice on the programming inside of them, and basically were used as gentrification motors in areas. So I had the time to be there for 5 years and then go. And basically there is now a lot, of course, of review on that policy. How can we do it different? So I think more and more the knowledge is getting in there that we need long-term spaces. We need to secure those spaces for an instance, social or cultural usage. And I think indeed, if you would be a club or some kind of initiative, you would need to have the right conditions, being able to transpire on that. So that also needs to come by help, I think, from a local government. Of course, I focus a lot on non-commercial experiment, but if we talk about club culture and nightlife, I would say investors, I completely agree with Lutz. This is a completely different discussion that needs to happen on there. But in the case of Amsterdam, I think they're making it possible, long-term spaces, but then really focused on, okay, how can multiple initiatives over a length of time redevelop, but we keep the space is secured for this kind of usage. Yeah.
That's good. You want to add up something, Jonas?
No, I mean, it's a very general remark, but like I was also immediately, when I was thinking about these temporary spaces, I mean, when you look at it from, let's say, a little bit more of a macro perspective, all these spaces are temporary. I mean, culture evolves and these things become mainstream, and or they manage to kind of keep a certain cutting edge for a long time, but at a certain moment they will become mainstream and people will search for new venues. So it's kind of a natural process in the long run. I don't think there's that's a policy needs to be directed towards that, or again, I mean, that's just the way culture kind of evolves, and especially within subcultures, these things are quite volatile, and this mainstream subculture dichotomy constantly changes, and that's the interesting thing about these subcultures, that it's so vibrant. So, I mean, even if we don't want it to be temporary, most things will kind of change status over time.
Yeah, totally. And I think what's important is to, because also speaking as someone who works with Trésor, for example, is something that is long-standing. Those spaces can exist. You know, Trésor is it's going to be 30 years old next year, and but within that long-standing thing, then it's also about the responsibility of you as an institution, which you will be after 30 years, whether you like it or not. Within that, make those changes that will be like your creative approaches. You know, it's nourishing the community that goes there and has been going there for 30 years, but then not just looking at that, but sort of like looking out a little bit, which I think is the problem sometimes when you've got places that become institutions. They kind of end up ultimately relying on the fact that they are institutions, and then you kind of get to this place of laziness and not really looking out to what could come in and rejuvenate it. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you all for this. It was really nourishing conversation. Gonna wrap it up. Should we say something after that? Thank our sponsor. So yeah, that's it. Really from my heart, really thank you. It was really good. I learned a lot, and see you around, and hopefully with the vaccine we're gonna be out in the dance soon.
The golden 20s are coming.
My expectations too high.
Yeah, thank you for the moderation. And
Yes,
thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.